How are you guys doing tonight?
Chocolate.
You got chocolate, and it makes us all happy.
You're a nice person.
I'm the nice person on your left. All right, so we don't have a whole lot of time. If we had a whole lot of time, we might go a little bit more leisurely to this text. Who has read the Bhagavad Gita, this book that's before us? Some of us have not read it. You have not read it, you bad man.
No, it's a class for beginners. It's the right place at the right time.
A little closer, my friend, away. Jeff's a good buddy. So I can give him all the crap I want to give him. Okay. So, the way that Heather described this first session is that I would orient you with the text. The wider theme of these two sessions is skill in action. I spent a bit of time today kind of looking over the text and just kind of feeling my way through it and kind of experiencing what I wanted to say about it. And what was kind of surfacing for me in the text was not skill in action, it was actually the theme of love. And I started to think about that a little more deeply. So this text is known for having the yoga of bhakti, which is the yoga of love, the yoga of devotion. And it's kind of interesting the way that that spins out. And I want to talk about that a little bit before we kind of walk into the game of skill in action, which we will do. We will not avoid that. But before I do that, and I know for some of you who've taken my Bhagavad Gita courses here before, this is kind of a review. I want to kind of orient the text in terms of India, in terms of the larger book that it's a part of, called the Mahabharata, and how it kind of sits within the philosophical systems of India. So I've got this stack of books here. We won't have time to read them all. But the Bhagavad Gita is part of a continuing dialogue in the Indian tradition, and of course more specifically in the yoga tradition. And of course it begins with the Rig Veda, begins with the Veda itself, which is like 4 texts. And these texts go back, anybody who's taken my workshop course, tell me the dates, a little bit of pop quiz. How far back do the Vedas go, does anybody know? Any kind of previous learning stuff?
4,000 years.
4,000 years. Well, it's good that we're reviewing it. Good. So Rig Veda, usually these texts, which are kind of the base texts of Hinduism, there's four Vedas. There's Rig Veda, Atharva Veda, Sama Veda, and Yaja Veda. And these 4 texts form the basis for pretty much the whole Indian religious tradition, what we call Sanatana Dharma, or we call Hinduism itself. So if we call something Hindu proper, it's because it dialogues with Veda. That said, not a lot of people read the Vedas. The Vedas are referenced a lot, but they're not well known. They are texts of stories, and they are chants, and they describe a culture which is rooted in ritual practice and is also a nomadic culture that becomes a kind of feudal culture. So it's sort of pre-city culture. Yeah? When we get to city culture, we have another group of texts which arises to kind of speak to the change in people's consciousness that arises in what we call civilization. And those texts are called the Upanishads. And when we get to Upanishads, we're getting to material that is much more in the kind of dialogical pattern of Hinduism. As I said, rarely do people read Rig Veda. You've got these kind of high-end scholars that even memorize the text. But Upanishads are actually well known, often by the common people. And it's in these texts, in terms of our tradition in this room, where we first get descriptions of yoga in the way that we understand yoga. We don't get postural yoga. We do get a little information about sitting upright and whatnot. But we get mantra, we get descriptions of different states of mind, and we get pranayama. So some of those other kind of limbs, those more subtle limbs of the Yoga Sutras that you guys may know, we get those described in Upanishads. But Upanishads are not a manual. They are sets of stories that usually revolve around a guru-disciple relationship, and it's kind of in a dialogical pattern. It's not really like Socratic method. It's more like instruction, because the guru is the smart guy. Yeah. And there's a pattern of bowing to the guru. It's not so much questioning the student, though that does happen. It's more about the guru dispensing usually his wisdom, sometimes her wisdom. So these texts follow that pattern, and they range from about 800 of the Common Era to about 800 before the Common Era to about 200 of the Common Era. I didn't say dates for Rig Veda. Rig Veda, or rather the Vedas in general, they are dated at their earliest point back to about maybe 1500 years before the Common Era, 1800 at the outside if you have a renegade scholar. Most scholars still kind of stick to about 1200 before the Common Era to about 800 into before the Common Era. When we get to Upanishads, about 800 years back, maybe 500 years back before the Common Era, before the birth of Christ, and about 200 years into it. And there's about 13 of these that we call Sruti. These two groups of texts get a really honored place that the Bhagavad Gita kind of partakes of sometimes. So the rishis, the saints who supposedly composed these, they had them revealed to them by direct contact. Yeah, they had them, literally we say they were heard. They were heard because the emphasis on sound is so important, because mantra is so important. So the gods spoke to them, and they kind of downloaded this stuff, so it's really seen as canonical. It's part of the canon of the tradition. It's really, really deep stuff. So we have Vedas, we have Upanishads, and then we have this other text which nobody reads because it's super boring. It's called Brahma Sutra. And the Brahma Sutra looks at the Upanishads and kind of tells us what to think about it. But really anybody reads this, so it's part of a tradition called Advaita Vedanta, which is a philosophical system that a lot of people pay attention to. Still, Brahma Sutras are really boring. I don't recommend them. When we get to, then next comes Bhagavad Gita, as far as chief text. And the reason I even bother to mention Brahma Sutras is because when we look at this really important philosophical tradition that really focuses on the Gita, that was kind of articulated by a teacher by the name of Sankaracharya in the 8th century, it says that Upanishads, Brahma Sutra, and Bhagavad Gita are the most important texts. So that's where Brahma Sutra comes in. Bhagavad Gita comes next. Brahma Sutra is written slightly before the Common Era. Bhagavad Gita, we say about 3rd century. And what Gita does is it kind of continues, it does all kinds of things. But in terms of the previous tradition, what it does is it talks a lot about what's called Samkhya philosophy, which is a dualistic philosophy. It kind of threads that in along with some other philosophical strains. And it kind of turns this argument that's been going on for a long time in the tradition between householders and yogis. So we have this idea mainly that the yogis are the guys or gals who are superior in terms of their path, that they are going to shed their karma more immediately, more efficiently, and that the householders, their lives are their reincarnation is going to be much more continued, and they're going to have a longer path. The yogi, it's more talking about a very extreme path. Bhagavad Gita is more about, hey, this life we have is okay, you can just go on living it, but if you just tweak a few things, you're going to make it to liberation. It's kind of one of the chief messages of Bhagavad Gita, and it gives us some new ways of thinking about yoga and doing yoga. So, Vedas, about 1200 years back to 800 years back, Upanishads, 800 years, Bhagavad Gita about 3rd century, and then early 4th century for Yoga Sutras, kind of the latest dating on this. And then after that, we start to get what we see in the Tantra tradition, things like the Narada Bhakti Sutras and other texts that go right up to about 1200 of the Common Era. And then we have what's our tradition, which is the Hatha Yoga tradition, and I give the representation of Hatha Yoga Pradipika. We have a range of texts that come around, say, after 1100 up to early modern period, Yoga Upanishads, Hatha Yoga Pradipika, Garanda Samhita, Shiva Samhita, and in these texts we get the description of our tradition. It's not an exclusive tradition that looks just at asana. It includes a strong emphasis on pranayama. It includes a strong emphasis on what we call Raja Yoga, meditation, but and it includes this whole practice of Shatkarma, which is deep cleansings in the body, and it's based on Kundalini science. It's about using the prana in the body to wake up the body, to let our mind focus so that we can have that Raja Yoga experience, but we do it by activating the body. So that's our tradition. That's Hatha Yoga, physical yoga tradition. And then after the modern era, things really shift. We don't really get the production of Sanskrit texts anymore.
What do you mean by modern era?
Modern era is after the British kind of incursion in India. We start to get this really hybrid culture.
So 1700s.
Yeah, this starts as early as the British East India Company is formed around, actually in the year 1600 by Queen Elizabeth, and they're following the Dutch East India Company, and by degrees, the West starts to have a strong dialogue with Indian culture. And by 1757, Britain starts to win. It wins its chief battle and starts to establish administrative control over India. And we get the British Raj in 1857, 100 years later. And that's when kind of the modern world, not the medieval world, starts to have a really strong dialogue with India. And by degrees, the whole kind of Pandit tradition shifts, and there's a bigger emphasis on English language. And some of the later texts that we get that are actually very important to us are like Yoga Makaranda, written by the great Krishnamacharya, and I think this was composed in Tamil. So it's composed in indigenous languages. He composed his Yoga Rahasya in Sanskrit. So he's kind of the last of the line as far as like our tradition goes, as far as who we're going to look at, who's writing in Sanskrit. Even he didn't compose all of his texts in Sanskrit, and he actually didn't compose a lot of texts. But he did Yoga Rahasya in Sanskrit, and then he wrote Yoga Makaranda in Tamil, if I've got that right. He also spoke some other Indian language like Karnataka, and also composed stuff in that, I believe. So Krishnamacharya is kind of the end of the line, but this stuff is also very important for our tradition, because he starts to give us moving yoga, he starts to give us vinyasa yoga, he starts to describe a yoga which is posturally based. So memorize this.
Great.
So
Get
you're
out your
saying
camera, take a picture.
that postural yoga and asanas are not happening in these early periods? You're not saying that?
Well, what we have is we have a textual record. We do have kind of moments in tantric history and even in the wider tradition of Indian dance where we see an articulation of posture sets. And we also have the whole tradition of austerity, which involves a lot of kind of difficult physical positions. But we don't get it all systematized as far as we know until we get to what we call the Hatha Yoga tradition, and we get this character called Garaksha who initiates that tradition.
Which is post-British.
No, that's pre-British, because that's dated to about 1200, circa 1200. And the British don't come in, like I say, until after 1600. And the West, though, starts to come in strongly. I mean, there's always been a dialogue with Romans, with the Greeks and all that stuff, but it hasn't been hugely intrusive. But in 1498, we get Vasco da Gama traveling to Calicut, and that kind of begins this big geopolitical dialogue between the Renaissance West and India, and there starts to be mercantile relations which are a little more involved, and it gradually leads to political control. And then that's when things kind of shift. We have this term now called Anglophone yoga. Modern yoga is Anglophone yoga. Anglo means English. It's basically a tradition, even in the 18th century, that was articulated in English, because we have Swami Vivekananda's work in the late 1800s, and it's in English, and he spoke English. So the modern yoga tradition is very much an English language tradition, which may not make it seem so exotic. But the Indians speak English because of British work there. So we have what's called Shruti. We have the root text of the tradition, Upanishads and Veda. And then everything that comes after is still holy. It's still seen as canon. It's not like it's sealed off like, oh, we just pay attention to, say, the Bible in Western tradition. Like, all this stuff still has a lot of weight, especially Bhagavad Gita, but it's called Smrti. It's at a different level than the stuff that was heard by the rishis. Yeah, it has a different quality. Bhagavad Gita, though, is kind of the supreme text of the tradition. Even though I said everything kind of roots back to Veda, and Vedas are giving pride of place, and a lot of people read Upanishads, mostly people read Bhagavad Gita because it's just so lovely to read. And I hope that in this session and the next, you guys catch fire with it, because it is super, super delightful. Part of the reason it's delightful is it's part of the larger dialogue of the Mahabharata, which is this epic poem, which kind of all Indians know because they learned it at their mother's and father's knee. And if they didn't, they learned it through TV shows. And it tells this wider story, which the Bhagavad Gita gives us a little chapter in, so to speak, of the struggle between two bands of brothers, the Kauravas and the Pandavas. And they are cousins who are fighting for a kingdom. And in Bhagavad Gita, we get one discrete existential moment in the general's life who's leading the good guys, the Pandavas. He gets in the middle of these two warring battles, and he has a little crisis, and he drops his weapon, and he wonders whether or not he should become a pacifist in that moment, because he's torn by these really powerful conflicting values. His role as a kshatriya, which is a member of the warrior caste, and his relationship to his brothers, or his cousins, who he's supposed to kill. Actually, they're, his cousins. And also his gurus, who were the gurus he shared with his cousins. He had the same gurus that taught them the arts of war, taught him, and he has to kill all of them because a bunch of them have joined the side of the bad guy, Duryodhana, who is the leader of the 100 bad brothers. There's lots of the bad brothers, just a few really good brothers. 5 Pandavas. Okay. All right, and the Pandava brothers are all the sons of gods anyway, so they're all super powerful. It's like superheroes. So, what else can I say? Other thing in terms of English language and in terms of the wider world community in Bhagavad Gita was the first text to be translated into Sanskrit. 1785, Charles Wilkins, a British Orientalist, got a hold of some Pandits and had them teach him Sanskrit, and he translated for the Royal Asiatic Society of Britain. He translated Bhagavad Gita, so it made its way into the Western world very quickly. It was the first to the gate, as it were. And after that, many, and there are more coming out every month, every year, of commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita come out, and there's a lot of really, really powerful ones. This one that I'm kind of holding in my hand is by Graham Schwig, a recent one, he's a Western scholar, and it's kind of brief, not too much commentary, not overweight, and a good guide, though there's many, good guides. All right, memorize all that?
I've got
Any
a
questions?
question. Yeah, I have a question. The history of India, includes so many libraries that have burnt, and I'm just wondering whether you think that there are many great texts that we would put in this line that we don't know about because they're burnt. I mean, I know it's impossible to know, but
yeah, I mean, the thing is that there's kind of a law of increasing returns, right? I mean, these texts have had a time to kind of simmer in world society. So for anybody who's kind of focused on the yogic tradition or the Hindu tradition, these texts are ones we concentrate on. If another text were to come in that was equally lively, like it was discovered and we translated it and maybe some people got excited about it, the chances are that it would like press in to this group and take a position in it is pretty unlikely, just because they would have to push against the whole weight of culture up to this point. But like Heather is saying, there was a lot of rack and ruin over Indian history. Even before the West showed up, it was never a unified country. There were always small warring kingdoms. Briefly, large parts of it were consolidated, but then it fell apart again. You always had Muslims fighting Hindus, and Huns coming in, and people up from the north, and Greeks coming in. So all kinds of disarray. And in the midst of that, yes, many libraries were burnt, but it's also a hugely scholarly culture which has produced so many heaps of texts that we haven't even begun. There's not even enough Sanskrit translators to do the work. We haven't even begun to even poke a hole or to even pull enough needles out of this massive haystack of text to start to translate even the texts we know about. Or even that we know exist. There's all kinds of libraries that are full of these manuscripts. They're rushing to kind of put them on, digitize them, so that later people have time to translate them. And then comes the process of like, well, how many scholars do you have to even focus on the translation, and the English language translation, and then understand the deeper meaning, and then popularize it? It's like there's a lot of kind of cultural momentum, as I said, moving in other directions. Here tonight we're studying a text that's been studied for thousands of years. We're giving even more emphasis to the Bhagavad Gita. It's accessible, it's available, it's just easy to get into. If you guys want to spend 12 years studying Sanskrit and get on the cutting edge where new texts are being discovered, I heartily encourage you. This takes some work. I heartily encourage you. Go for it. Lead the way. I will follow.
Can you speak at all to some of the different translations? Presumably you've looked at.
Yeah, a little bit. There are
Specifically of the Bhagavad Gita.
Yeah, Bhagavad Gita. I mean, there's important commentaries throughout history. There's Abhinavagupta, the great tantric scholar, did a commentary on Bhagavad Gita. There's one by Janeshvari, which is really important. He actually comes from Pune, where the great poet Janeshvari comes from Pune, where, of course, B.K.S. Iyengar was. We get translations that are kind of songified in the late 1800s, which become popular in the West. I'm trying to remember the name of that guy who wrote that important kind of transliteration of the text. We get Swami Prabhavananda and Christopher Isherwood do important translation in the 1940s, which kind of brings it into the Western ken. And Swami Satchidananda, who wrote an important commentary in the Yoga Sutras, and it came to America in 1966 and started his form of integral yoga, wrote an important commentary in the Bhagavad Gita. And of course, our good man Gandhi did as well. And of course, he relied on it a great deal to formulate his Satyagraha, his truth force doctrine. And then other contemporaries of Gandhi also wrote commentaries. I'm trying to think of that guy who's also his name is slipping my mind. Often interpreting actually in the opposite direction, that the Bhagavad Gita tells us to fight rather than to not fight. Who else can I point to? It's important. Yeah, does that help?
So there's all the Westerners who wrote all them, like Feuerstein.
Yeah, Feuerstein wrote a really big one that just came out, and it's
that one.
A big one to approach. He includes a lot of important essays, and his translation is a little bit heavy-handed and a little bit non-poetic, so it's not such a great one to go after. I mean, I have my favorites. Stephen Mitchell is a great linguist, and he's written a very poetical translation of the Bhagavad Gita, though with, I think, zero commentary. And then this guy, he's very little known, but it's actually my favorite translation. It's by a guy named, he just goes by the name of P. Lal. He's an Indian scholar, and this is his fourth translation of the Gita. And it's just very simple verse. He gives you the Sanskrit. It doesn't give you hardly any commentary, just beginning essays and ending essays, but really, really insightfully and beautifully rendered. Yeah, that might be a good place to start. And then I'm just a fan of Graham Schweig's. I picked this up a couple of years ago. He's a very respected Indologist, studier of the Indian traditions, and he gives light commentary, gives a few footnotes here and there, gives you a nice and kind of rich introductory essay, and then kind of leaves the text alone. But he drives kind of a nice line between scholarship and a poetic voice.
Thank you.
Well, all right, anything else? Are we done? All right. So let's crack the text open a little bit. Heather, how are you doing?
I'm great.
Good.
I have a question.
Good.
Why is it that or maybe you could tell us more about the Hare Krishnas, and they only follow that text?
You can pull this one out too, because that's the Hare Krishna one, I think. That one, yeah.
Or why is it that they follow that text?
They follow this text because Krishna is king. Their view of the Godhead is that it comes down through Krishna, that he is the chief deity, he is the lord of all the deities. So they look to the Puranic stories about Krishna and his life, and Bhagavad Gita as key. And of course this Bhagavad Gita as it is by Swami Bhaktivedanta Prabhupada. I didn't even mention him. It's probably the most popular translation of the Gita, partly because it's been given out for free for decades, but it is a respected translation and commentary even by scholars. But it's also a sectarian translation and commentary. It speaks in terms of his beliefs from the Krishna consciousness movement. But the reason Gita is, of course, taking pride of place is because, hey, Krishna is one of the main protagonists here. It's him and Arjuna having the conversation. and this is a big text for the rest of the Hindu tradition. So they want to kind of be involved in interpreting it because they're a bit of an evangelical organization, and it's kind of a gateway to getting people to understand their tradition through this tradition. All right, so let's open it up, and we'll just read a little bit of it. And do you have a Bhagavad Gita?
No, you're welcome to take
Grab
one of those.
They're everywhere.
I didn't even bring all of mine.
Best. You get the best one.
Can I see Mitchell's copy?
You may. So go ahead and turn to chapter 2. If we look at the first chapter, it's basically kind of setting up the story. It tells us who all the warriors are. It brings us from that larger lens to the narrowed lens of Arjuna bringing his chariot into the middle of the battlefield. So just a little more background before we read this a little bit. The dialogue takes place in this kind of non-space, this kind of liminal space, the space between. Literally, it's the space between the two warring armies, but once the dialogue begins, it's just kind of Krishna and Arjuna and their one little panel in the comic book, sharing conversation. Krishna is, of course, a god, and Arjuna, in the course of this story, especially in the 11th chapter, it dawns on him that Krishna is a god, but till this time he's just kind of known him as a fellow king, and a very valued king, a very highly respected king. In fact, the two brothers kind of fought over his siding with them in the two wars, and Krishna was chosen by Arjuna in his person. He said, oh, I can't decide who you guys I should fight for, who wants my army and who wants me. And of course, Duryodhana took the army, because he's a materialist. He thinks materialist means things, that's the evil side. And Arjuna chose Krishna himself, chose his counsel, chose his support, chose his divine presence. So, of course, that has a deeper meaning. He's the choice between spirit and matter. Duryodhana, because he is evil, he chose matter. He chose the army, the apparent sign of victory, whereas Arjuna chose the spirit of Krishna, the presence of Krishna. So Krishna is his good friend. He's actually literally his cousin. He is his chariot driver. He said he will not lift his hand in war. That was the other stipulation. He said, you can have me, but I'm not even going to fight for you. So he does have great power, but he's not going to fight. He's just driving the chariot for Arjuna, who has his amazing Gandharva bow and his other weapons, and Arjuna will fight. Later on, of course, in the story of the Mahabharata, Krishna will even break that vow. It's kind of a whole social breakdown. He does fight. So, larger story, Mahabharata, the fighting between these two sets of brothers, and we come to this kind of critical moment. This is actually, there's 18 books in the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata is about 100,000 verses, one of our longest epic poems. Just goes on and on and on forever. And the composition of that is about 500 years before the Common Era. But Bhagavad Gita, as I say, comes later, and it's kind of like stuck in the 6th book. So this was probably composed by someone else, and it was composed as a philosophical treatise. It was composed as a manual for yoga, but like many things in many traditions, it uses stock characters. It uses characters from an existing tradition to create a conversation with the wider populace. Like if I decided to tell a story and I use Socrates and Jesus, people would immediately be interested because I'm using characters that you already know and you already attribute wisdom to. So that's partly what the unknown author of Bhagavad Gita has done. We usually attribute to this guy named Vyasa, but Vyasa is just means scribe. And Vyasa is said to be actually the grandfather of Arjuna, but it's also those are just kind of mythical lineages, mythical family trees. So Krishna's name means the dark, and Arjuna's name means the light. So there's this dialogue between the guru, the heaviness, darkness of the guru, the shadow side of the personality, which is the completion of who we are. So the guru kind of represents that. He represents our wholeness. He represents that which cannot see, that which we see, that which is transcendent, that which is beyond our everyday mind. And Arjuna, of course, is that creature who's in the light. He's in the light of day. He's in the light of our open, everyday, common consciousness. So we have Arjuna and Krishna.
Question.
Yeah.
You said earlier, you talked about the concept of guru, of student and teacher. And I've been thinking about that because with with Mr. Iyengar's passing, I've been chanting the Guru Gita, kind of absorbing the Guru Gita, which is, is all about devotion to Guru. And it just really, I have a lot of curiosity about that importance of the Guru, because Western culture appreciates teachers, but does not believe in the divinity of gurus. It doesn't. And so I'm wondering if you have any idea about the development of it. Like, it's almost like the cult of the guru. And can you elucidate that for me?
Well, it's, the thing about India that is just so compelling is that even though it's a modern society, it still maintains a lot of its rituals and relationships to a primal past. In some ways, it's very much like Islam in that way. It still has its pre-modern element in it very strongly. It really has a strong primal element. It has a strong mystical element. The sense of higher consciousness, the sense of animal consciousness. Both those things are much more present in this tradition. It's partly why it's so vital for us. If you look back to the early tradition, of course, you have a powerful kind of language of hierarchy. You have a language of hierarchy because these were nomadic peoples, the Aryans who came down into India from the northwest and who authored the Vedas, were nomadic peoples. They were warriors. They were in a kind of chain of warrior command, and they were in a time in human civilization when there was just a lot of fighting. When you've got a lot of fighting, you've kind of got to form yourself into strong social bonds so that you can fend off your enemies. So you have this kind of it's almost a militaristic relationship that is, we would call it patriarchal, and it has a lot to do with honoring your ancestors, honoring your superiors. In fact, that honor and submission is key to the culture's survival. So that gets translated from what we might call the secular sphere, from the sphere of mere survival. We might call, in the proper term is laukika, the kind of the outward world, the world of on this earth, the immanent world, to the tradition of the gurus and their students. The name Swami literally means master, and that relationship of student to teacher is one of very, very profound submission, not only because of the cultural moorings that it came from, but because it is understood that the guru channels divine energy. And the way to partake of that energy is to have an intimate relationship with the person of the guru. There is the archetype that the guru takes part in. There is the massive space of consciousness that the guru, usually through his work, but sometimes we do have female gurus, through his work has gained access to. And if you seek his blessing, you have kind of got to walk the walk that he wants you to walk, because he can only convey this information within the most intimate of bonds. It's not something, we have this phrase from Bible, don't throw pearls before swine. I had a conversation the other day with two people who were deeply rooted in the scientific tradition, and I was trying to convey to them the Indian worldview, which is based on a radical subjectivity. And I was walking them through it very logically, and at some point they just balked. They wouldn't answer my questions. And I could tell it was like they wouldn't go there. They wouldn't go to that extreme place of subjectivity. I mean, the conversation broke down when I asked them this question. We'd gotten to this place, you might not understand it without the context, but I said, is H2O H2O? Is water water? And they wouldn't even answer that question. It seemed like a very rational question, but it was part of a whole conversation we were having. I was trying to walk them into seeing the reality of their subjective sense. it is within that subjective sense of the purely personal guru and the purely personal chela or student in which this deeper information is conveyed, because even if you have a guru who partakes of the infinite, he or she is still a finite being. And there are still finite conditions under which the teachings are even possibly conveyed. And those conditions are specific to the relationship. And so the relationship is crafted over a period of time carefully so that it can be a container, just like the container of any intimate relationship, for deeper things, for deeper knowledge to be conveyed. And arguably the deepest knowledge that can possibly be conveyed between two people.
So that makes sense. My last question, I think, is critical to understanding Gita is what you mean by radical subjectivity.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, because it was just something that dawned on me. After this conversation I had with these people, it was really upsetting to me, because these were close friends. One of them was a close friend of mine, the other was his girlfriend who I just met. And it was upsetting to me. It's like at some point the conversation broke down, and I didn't proceed further from that point, because I'd come into those situations before, and I knew that if I proceeded without that dropping in, that I would be betraying my knowledge. I would be betraying what I know. And so I was thinking about that. Why didn't that conversation work? And one thing that I realized is that their view of subjectivity is Freudian. It's merely a Western idea of subjectivity, which is, we see it subject to error. Oh, objectivity is what we trust. If we all get together as democratic people and we see something, we're more likely to see reality, because each one of us is occluded. Each one of us has an occluded consciousness. Each one of us is merely confined by our own prejudices and preferences. Right? So that's the way that we generally see subjectivity. But it is only through the subjective capacity, in the deepest, deepest, deepest sense, that we gain access to the greatest objectivity, which is the objectivity of the subtle nature of the universe. And that is a fact that is conveyed through the tradition and through the experience of practice. But if you just try and present that to someone who's used to this usual idea of what it means to think on my own, you assume that the person who's thinking on their own is more subject to error than someone who's corrected by somebody else. So radical subjectivity is this, what comes to us in meditation. Deep, 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 deep introversion of consciousness, exploration of the subtle, subtle sense, which is the only instrument that we have that can truly apprehend the nature of the universe. So that's radical subjectivity, and it only comes through practice. It's not knowledge, really, in the sense that we think about knowledge. It's not something that I could tell you, or anybody could tell me, or someone could be told. It's something that could be conveyed through the Guru's power. It's something that could be reached through intense practice. But it's not knowledge in the sense that we in the West usually think about knowledge. Though in the tradition we call it knowledge, we call it jnana or vijnana, we call it high knowledge, or we just use that term knowledge. Does that work?
Yeah, I have many more questions, but I think we need to stick to it. Yeah, luckily we have a second
Well, all this
session.
relates. All this relates.
It does.
Because since we're still kind of doing this overview, what is going on in Gita is another thing I realized as thinking about this idea of love, is that it's a deep, deep love between two men. And we don't often see that in Western culture. It's this intimate relationship, and it's happening on many, many levels. It's guru and student. It's cousin and cousin. It's king and king. It's friend and friend. It's warrior and warrior. They have all of these relationships, and the dialogue unfolds within this kind of august space of this God speaking, but it has this very friendly tone. It's really kind of a fascinating kind of midline that the conversation partners walk. They kind of walk this beautiful line between the casualness of friendship and the augustness of infinite knowledge, deep, deep knowledge.
So are you saying, when you're talking about radical subjectivity and the difference between Western knowledge and Eastern knowledge, are you saying that, like, so every time I read the Gita, I understand the Gita in a different way because I have the knowledge, the experience of having read it before, so I'm able to triangulate differently. Is that radical subjectivity, whereas like a Freudian subjectivity is just saying that knowledge is one thing, that is face value? It's saying that I can't understand it more deeply because there's only one way to understand it?
Well, what I was trying to point to is this sense of subjectivity having to do with just our little personality.
You mean that Freud defines subjectivity as being a little personality rather than this sense, which sounds much deeper.
Yes, and I'm not even sure if Freud defines subjectivity, but when we think of subjectivity in the West, we think of just the capacity that one individual mind has. We don't think of just the capacity that one individual mind has as access to the infinite. And that's what the individual mind has. And that's what a pursuit of radical subjectivity makes available to you. And it happens in these moments of deep study and concentration, focus, feeling. It's definitely an emotional process. And the deeper we go with the text or in any relationship, more is revealed. And so the relationship that we have with the text is very much like the relationship we have with a person. The more we connect with a person, the more we kind of transcend human personality. We start to see how universality, what is of the greater whole, is expressed through what is particular, through a particular person. How we start to see one another as God. Sound like a good plan?
Just a comment on, Heather, what you were saying about this kind of anxiety that you see in the guru and Western culture. I just wonder if it has to do with that sense, that different understanding of subjectivity, so that there's a more of a danger and anxiety of what that relationship might be, because it is based on a kind of a different notion of what's objective and what you should be following, or what's sort of safe to follow.
Yeah, what is safe to follow? That's often what comes in. What is safe to follow?
Right.
And that's really what comes in when we start to pursue the individual mind, is that we don't have the conversation with our social group as a corrective. And that's usually why it scares people to go further, is that we feel safe in objectivity. We feel safe in what we call consensus consciousness. If I think like everybody else thinks, I know that nobody will attack me. I know that no one will get angry at me. They're not going to put me up on a cross and crucify me, right? I mean, that's kind of where that's kind of the deep, one of the kind of the gates we have to cross in exploring that subjective capacity, because it's not necessarily going to find ready affirmation in the people that we know.
It's not like there isn't also a somewhat of a parallel history in Western culture of the intimacy between scholars, between teachers and students, Plato and Socrates.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a long line of that deep kind of intimacy.
Yeah.
But that's a little bit different than like a guru.
But it is very much the same. When you look at like the Greek tradition, it is very much the same. Yeah. Should we read a little bit of this book?
Mm-hmm.
I could talk all day. So the second chapter is kind of the chapter that we're concerned with, as far as this particular phrase, skill in action. So if you'll turn to 47 through 50, we'll just kind of read that and we'll unpack a little bit of the text itself.
You're talking about the end of the second chapter.
Yes, the end of the second chapter. The first chapter we kind of get, as I say, the setup, what the basics of the story are, and this act by Arjuna to drop his bow and refuse to fight. And then we get this long argument that goes on till about chapter 11 between Arjuna and Krishna And this is kind of the opening sally by Krishna. He's going to explain to Arjuna why he's wrong on several counts, by several methods. So would someone want to read maybe 47 through 50? And we'll play around with it a little bit. You want to read Stephen Mitchell?
Sure. Just making sure that this is
Oh, then how's the numbering go on that?
2.43 to 47. I'm assuming this
It's more
is the,
rough. 43, 44, 45, 46, 47. Yeah, that's probably it.
okay, 4750.
Yeah.
You have a right to your actions, but never to your actions' fruits. Act for the action's sake, and do not be attached to inaction. Self-possessed, resolute, act without any thought of results, open to success or failure. This equanimity is yoga. Action is far inferior to the yoga of insight, Arjuna. Pitiful are those who, acting, are attached to their actions' fruits.
Is that it?
Oh, one more. The wise man lets go of all results, whether good or bad, and is focused on the action alone. Yoga is skill in actions.
There we go. We got the quote for the workshop. That's where I wanted to end up. So this is a nice little set of verses, and in them there is a lot of which we might kind of even use to sum up the larger corpus of the text, the larger message of the text. So I kind of threw down this theme that what we're doing in Gita is we're attempting to privilege the householder tradition, of trying to privilege what we call the brahmanas, those who have not stepped out of social life and decided to take the path of the yogi. To do that, you've got to validate what householders do. And what householders do is they act. They don't refrain from action. They don't get out of the social stream. They still have relationships to family. They still have relationships to spouses. They still have relationships to jobs, to civic relationships, to cities, to countries, to states. So what the author of the Gita is trying to do is to actually redefine the whole project of yoga. He again and again, he takes yoga and he gives us a new definition of it. And he'll just use the term yoga and then go on to explain what he says yoga is. He doesn't really bother to even explain that he's doing a kind of a little bit of linguistic sleight of hand. We see a little bit of it here. He's comparing the yoga of this, well, he says, okay, let me just read this a little bit. He says, still, action is by far inferior to the yoga of discernment, O conqueror of wealth. Seek shelter in discernment. Miserly are those who are motivated by the fruits of action. So he's playing around a lot with these terms of action and knowledge, or action and discernment. And those are kind of the two key polarities in this difference between the yogis and the householders. The householders, as I said, are involved in action. The yogis are involved in jnana. They're involved in the path of gaining knowledge, because knowledge is the key to transcendent understanding. In fact, it is transcendent understanding. He's even kind of like claiming that territory for his yoga of karma, his karma yoga. When he says this phrase, he's kind of rebranding it the yoga of discernment, even though we're used to calling that other yoga the yoga of discernment. The yoga of jnana yoga, the yoga of the pursuit of knowledge, is called tarka. It's the yoga of discernment. Yeah. But he's saying when you do action, the way you make action yoga is you discern. So he's kind of claiming the territory of discernment for the yoga of action. The way action becomes yoga is that you apply discernment. And therefore a new yoga is created in which discernment determines the quality of the action. So he does this all throughout the book. He's bringing together many, many streams of understanding, many, many philosophical streams, and he's spinning them in a new direction in terms of this new understanding that he has. And the understanding he has is that if we, just in rough, if we continue to perform actions, we can still arrive at a place where we have cleared our karma in this lifetime if we surround our intention with discernment. If we are so clear about our intentions and so clear about how we feel about our actions and are always refusing to claim the fruit of that action, then we can clear our karma. The actions themselves will actually work on our behalf because they will be a devotional offering. They will be like a sacrifice. They will be like what was done in the early rituals, something given away to the gods, and that will help clear my karma.
You described anger yoga just right now.
Good. I'm glad I'm speaking to this community.
You did. Like, I'm just thinking specifically like about the practice that we just did. Discernment, you said discernment determines the quality of the action. So if you go and you do something mindfully, the quality of that experience will be higher than if you do something not mindfully, right? You get a sense, often you'll have a sense of peace if you did it mindfully, or you have a sense of focus that kind of gets rid of the britties, it gets rid of any other noise. You're so focused on what you're doing. And then you, at least in the body, might feel free afterwards. If you really like went for something with your whole body, your whole mind, your whole spirit, your whole breath, it creates a sense of release, it creates a sense of peace that you wouldn't have if you just moved through the action.
That's why you make this work so hard.
Yeah, I mean today's class especially, because we were really focusing really hard on getting specific actions. Do it this way and see what happens when you do it. And then it was like, wow, you know, you really get relaxed afterwards. Wow, you know, something really opens and you find, wow, something was there that I was looking for. Because I was so focused. You know, we don't always practice that way, but we did an hour ago.
Yeah, so we have this technology of concentration, right? And we see it throughout the whole tradition, and it's applied in all these different ways. And we see it even in the modern Western tradition. If we think about all the philosophies of will and focusing that are attempting to manifest something in your life, all of these deal with concentration. Concentration is always the key. But what we see here is we see concentration applied in a very specific way. We see it applied to intention and the capacity for letting go. Go ahead and act. Make sure that before you act, you have discerned the situation carefully and that you are not acting out of greed or out of personal bias or out of some erroneous sense of impulse. And then after the act is done, burn it completely, as the Buddhists say. Let there be no ash left. Don't have any karmic residue. Don't say, oh, wow, I really did a heck of a job today in that workshop.
No, we all kind of left feeling like, God, there's a lot more work to be done.
Or, you know, man, I am pretty damn amazing at teaching the Gita. You know, or, wow, you go home and you count your money from something. All of those kinds of things. Pride, or even bitterness, the opposite side, anger. All of that stuff is karmic residue. And whether it's good karma or bad karma, it's karma. And what you do in the afterglow, what you do after the act is kind of released into the ether, is also important. If you stay attached to it, still trying to gain some fame or infamy or whatever, or benefit from it, then you're attached. You're still garnering karma from an act that should have been clean and pure and released after it was effective. So he gives us that method of approaching action, of doing karma yoga, and it is bound to a second approach, which is bhakti yoga. And bhakti yoga is this yoga of love, the yoga of an approach in this text to Krishna or to anything that is divine that is beyond you. And it's through the information that comes, the kind of spirit that comes in that connection, that allows you to have the presence of mind to do karma yoga. You couldn't just do karma yoga. You couldn't just decide to do karma yoga. There has to be some kind of practice, and the kind of practice that he is recommending is bhakti yoga. Give it all, give all the crap Give all what's left, give all the ashes that you haven't burned to me, to Krishna. Just, I'm here, I'm the Godhead, I'm vast, I'll absorb it all, I'll recycle it, just dump it on me. So those two yogas are linked together. I see Laura's got a wrinkled brow.
You what?
Did you have a question?
I lost you with that last part.
Would you repeat it? What's the last part that you got lost on?
So I understand the part about letting the detachment. That's the part about
Letting the ashes burn?
That's so hard about Iyengar Yoga is the detachment part, right? After the fact. And not holding on to it in pride or bitterness or whatever. But what, giving it to whom? For what? To sacrifice? I got lost at that part.
Yeah, so...
How is that devotional?
Yeah, it's devotional, and it's devotional in a kind of specific sense, because the way that it builds on the dialogue of the previous tradition is it uses metaphors and ideas and concepts from the Veda. And the Veda it came from a ritual culture where you had a primary ceremony called the yajna, where you had a fire in the middle of this, very carefully constructed ritual space, and you made sacrifices. You threw stuff into the fire. You burned it up. It burned up, and it went up to the gods. Yeah, and the sacrifice was a key concept, and it was a sacrifice which was said to engineer the benefit. It's not like necessarily payment, though in our Western economy you might think of it that way. It's more like I give up, I let go of something, I sacrifice a goat, or I throw melted butter into the fire, or a lot of the traditional things they do. The gods receive it as a gift, but the gods are free to give a boon or not. It is kind of like a bribe. It is a little bit like what we saw in the medieval period with the Catholic Church, and a lot of it is kind of argued against that way, that it's just this quid pro quo, give something, get something, that you're still, and we'll see that criticism in Gita, that you're still tied into karma if you're just giving and getting. Yeah, get away from that. But if it has this element of sacrifice, then there's a surrender involved, and it's that kind of surrender which happens with both the breath, surrender each breath, and with the actions, and it can be done more easily done in the space of love. In the space of love for the greater power, which is kind of ready to receive all of the karma that you might have collected from an error you made in your acting or your intention. Believe me? A little bit. It's sort of like, I don't know what can we compare it to? I don't know. Maybe when you're a kid and you do something and your parents defend you, they explain the problem to somebody else. They make it good. Sort of like that. The deity will always make it good if you just surrender it to the deity. It kind of gets dissolved in the fire of the Guru's presence.
So maybe it's just a semantic of surrender versus sacrifice that makes it a different concept, isn't it?
Yeah, and I guess I'm kind of tripping up on that, right? In the Western view, we think of surrender and sacrifice as a bad thing. It's like we think of the martyr and martyr consciousness and giving up something. But this is sacrifice. This sacrifice is a very, very positive concept. It's that concept that we let go of attachment. When I give alms to the poor, or when I give money to a religious institution, or just let something go, there's a benefit that comes from letting go, from not being attached.
There's a huge benefit. I'm just thinking about practice, like the asana practice, like you work so hard, you work so hard, you work so hard. You get a few minutes of relaxation, and afterwards, I always feel, at least my practice these days, like it's in the rearview mirror. Like I can't say, well, God, I did a great job. And I can't say like, oh, I did a bad job, because it's in the rearview mirror. The karma's been burnt up.
In the text, it's funny, he spins this so many ways. All the verses are so dense with meaning. And he actually says the best way to get what you want, the best way to be successful in this world of karma, is to let go of it all. You will actually get more wealth. And whether or not you actually believe that's true is an open question. But he actually says that. He says if you really want to be on the path of karma, if you really want to be on the path of being successful and achieving things in this world, then this is actually the wish-fulfilling cow. This is also going to allow you to conquer wealth. So if you can let go of wanting wealth, it's actually, the benefit is that you're going to get it. So he spins it that way. He tries to entrain your self-interest. To recruit your self-interest. Yeah. To give up self-interest. All right, so let me read through this, and I think in light of what I've just said, it'll maybe land a little more fully. It is in action alone that you have a claim, never at any time to the fruits of such action. Never let the fruits of action be your motive. Never let your attachment be to inaction. So he plays it both ways. Don't be the yogi either. I'm not going to say it's okay to be the yogi. You still got to act. Yeah? Don't be attached to inaction either. You've still got to be in this world being active, but let go of it. Find a different attitude. Established in yoga, perform actions. Having relinquished attachment. O conqueror of wealth, Dhananjaya. So he actually calls him that. He's the conqueror of wealth. He's speaking to Arjuna. Arjuna will conquer wealth, both by being detached from it and by allowing it to come to him. While remaining the same in success and in no success, such sameness is said to be yoga. So he does this again and again. He redefines yoga. He's saying this sameness, this equanimity, that's yoga. He just defined yoga for us. He'll do that again and again and again. Yoga isn't all these austerities. Yoga isn't pranayama. Yoga isn't the yoga of focus, Raja Yoga from Yoga Sutras. It is the sameness. Its equivalence is yoga. You need to kind of watch for that. He'll do it again and again. He'll redefine yoga for us. Still, action is by far inferior to the yoga of discernment. Now he's redefining discernment. O conqueror of wealth. He uses the same term. So he keeps bringing it back into the worldly sphere. Wealth. Seek shelter in discernment. Miserly. And that's a concept that relates to wealth, of course. So he's like telling you to be generous through this conversation. Miserly are those who are motivated by the fruits of action. So he says, don't get greedy. Don't be motivated by the phala, the fruit that comes from what you do. One absorbed in the yoga of discernment casts off in this world both good and bad acts, both good and bad karma. Therefore, be absorbed in yoga. And now he defines yoga. Again, he gives us, in just a short section, he's defined yoga twice. For yoga is skillfulness in action. And it doesn't just mean skillfulness in action in the sense that we might think of it like, oh, I'm really good at sewing a shirt. Oh, I'm really good at driving a car. Oh, I'm really good at doing yoga. But rather, skillfulness in action comes from the intention you set up around action. It's the mood that you create. It's the attitude that you develop before and after you act. That's skill. Therefore, be absorbed in yoga, for yoga is skillfulness in action. Some translations is just simply skill in action.
So then what does surrender do? Is it sort of like an ego eradicator? So like there's more, maybe it's more of a Christian philosophy, but that if I operate by my self-interest, then I'm going to get a certain result. If I tap into like a higher consciousness, then life seems to go more easily. And so if I surrender myself, which often is maybe seen as like sort of a negative thing, self-talking, self-criticism, then I'm bypassing that sort of heady modality, and then the world's going to basically provide.
That's the kind of trust that it offers. Yeah, that's the kind of faith and promise that it offers. And it's interesting to kind of map this across to our Western understanding of like ambition, right, and becoming. The sense that growth is critical and that building wealth is important. And I would not suggest that it contradicts it, but I would say that it teaches us to have a generous mind in the midst of it. Because we are responsible for ourselves first, right? We've got to take care of ourselves. And that capacity to take care of self allows you to take care of others. So it's actually a very, very, I think, American text. It's a very modern text in that regard because it is affirming action. But I think it's asking you to have a wide purview. It's asking you to see the whole and to act in the terms it gives us, act in terms of your personal dharma, your personal law, your inner talent, your inner relationship to the world, so that it moves your own evolution forward in the same context of moving the world's evolution forward. So we know that there are right acts for us, and usually our conscience will guide us. Our conscience is that kind of vibrating point which connects to the rhythm of the universe.
So full surrender taps you into basically the more universal energy, which might in the end provide more abundance and more and greater things if you just kind of get out of the way sort of philosophy.
Yeah, it's promising you that. So that's kind of, and we might say that's the exoteric meaning. That's the meaning that is kind of overt. If we take it one step further and we look at the esoteric meaning, and we look at the covert meaning, if you arrive at a place where you see the whole world as wealth, or you arrive at a place where you see that nature and the rhythm of the universe is taking care of you, then the desire for worldly wealth is transcended. And that means that the wealth that comes to you may come unbidden. It may come in a way that's very little to do with your action, which does directly contradict the idea of pulling yourself up from your bootstraps, of striving in this world that is so powerful in Western culture.
Yeah, I have to say. Oh, go ahead.
Well, it seems like like we are frequently operating from a small self place. And so when we're talking about surrender, it's first of all, from that place, that's the place where we don't want to surrender, and that's where the whole idea of surrendering gets sort of a bad rap, because it's like from operating from there, like we don't want to do that, that would not be a good thing. But then if we do surrender from that place, we are surrendering to the higher place, and then we can then operate from that other place, and then the experience is not founded in like any of the small self desires.
Yeah, that's the idea. Don't be founded in your small self desires, because that will lead you astray. It'll close down your consciousness. You'll have less discernment. You won't see things as clearly. You'll make choices that seem to be in your benefit, but probably are not.
So with small self, we can somehow get the small self to surrender.
Yeah.
It's a great thing.
Yeah, it's a great
Small
thing.
self just does not think that.
It's a great thing. And for me, so much of this is interfaced with modern kind of, and I really call it the tradition of American philosophy, the idea, the kind of path of manifestation technologies where you deeply affirm the creative capacities of the individual. You deeply affirm the productive capacities of the individual. And that is a very American view, and I think that there are many, many points of compromise and agreement in those views, because this creative agent can work at its extreme, can work in really powerfully creative ways, can really help to form the universe, society. And if that's done with meditation, if that's done with these higher practices, your higher discernment is operative. So your choices tend to benefit not just you. You're acting with a generosity, you're acting in a creative powerful, even wealth-producing path, which is not selfish, which also has the strong ethic of serving others and serving the universe. And I really believe that's true. I believe that we all have a swadharma, that's a term it gives us, that is beneficial to the universe. We all have a way of unfolding our personality and our place in this world which serves both ourselves and others. Even the financiers. I mean, I really believe that, you know, most tasks on this earth can be done in a way that serves the planet. Maybe not coal manufacturers or something, but
Well, they can be, but they aren't. I mean, you know, when I read, you know, miserly are those who are motivated by the fruits of action. You know, I look around and most of what's happening that I see in the world, you know, is that there are miserly actions, and that there are very few who are trying to be thoughtful. And, you know, personal experience of an equity firm taking over the company that I work for. So it's kind of timely that you're talking about this, and I'm watching, you know, the most egregious and gross acts of, I look at this today and I'm like kind of despairing. It's like, well, there are some of us who are gathered and who are thinking about this, but I don't see, you know, how does the author and some of these other thinkers approach the fact that most often this isn't absorbed by people and cultures
and
in the
again,
world.
that's kind of the rub where we also kind of get lost, and that's kind of where radical subjectivity comes in again. Because if we think about the Buddha, or we think about Jesus, or we think about Muhammad, they didn't really get depressed at the state of the world. They saw the state of the world as an opportunity for their own creative capacity. They saw what was undharmic as an opportunity to perform the Dharma even more strongly, and that's true for every one of us, right? We control this instrument, and this instrument has infinite capacity. Whatever we dream, we can create. It will take time. We're in a finite world, and we have to work with the levers of a finite world. We have to work with limits, but we have infinite capacity, and if we focus there, we can come through it. We can come through and change the world around us if that's what we see what our Dharma is. So if we return to this radical subjectivity, you know your own mind. You know your own intentions. And maybe from this experience of what in American philosophy we'd call contrast, of encountering something that we're uncomfortable with, or that doesn't seem to fit your idea of what is proper, you gain creative insights and establish creative opportunities to change that, right? You are a change agent.
Right.
Yeah. And so this brings us back to that full empowerment. That's the amazing thing about this tradition, is that it gives us endless lives in which to achieve our ultimate capacities, and it affirms our capacity to achieve the ultimate. It doesn't put a ceiling on any of us. Yeah. Once we're you know, this human consciousness is a gateway to infinite power. So go out there and exercise your power.
That's the right answer. It's the right answer.
I have one more quick question.
Corey Martinez.
So in the Bhagavad Gita, is Krishna advising Arjuna to also have respect for his cousin who's on the opposite side, to have respect for his role and what he's doing?
He doesn't get into that, no. As far as I recall. I mean, he says that Duryodhana is already dead. And you're just performing the act of Dharma, you're just executing it. You have the privilege of executing it. No, he doesn't really get into whether Duryodhana should be, and his brother should be respected.
I feel like that's like somehow I feel like I have that recollection from it, but I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, there is definitely a tone of kind of warrior ethic in the midst of it, where your adversaries are respected as worthy. And there are codes of battle which support that. Yeah.
Because they felt like that could relate to like what we come up against in the world, you know, just seeing how like it all having its purpose and
softening some of the moral polarities.
but if not,
Yeah, I mean, yeah, maybe you will write a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, which you bring that
I
out.
will not be putting that on my list.
Just a short blog. All right, we're about out of time. Let's do a little bit of a closing meditation. Let's find a comfortable sitting position. So take our hands to our heart, close our eyes. We didn't go fully into the particular verses this session. In the next session, we'll pull more specifically from the text. Today, we took more of an overview of kind of the philosophical context, historical context of the book. But we'll let that transmission, that encounter with the wisdom of the Gita, just kind of percolate freely in our heart and our mind. See characters, see the ideas, feel the historical weight of the text and its capacity to open up our minds, to clear confusion, to give us gifts of understanding. And we'll do one Om to seal the deal. Take a full breath in. And we bow. Here's our head, our eyes. Clap 3 times.